All right, Dr. Micah Killion, thanks for joining me in this first project in this new studio.
Sounds great in here. Everything diffuses in the right way.
It's only going to get better. It's only going to get better. I've been eager to have you for a while. The amount of thought and detail you put into just your curiosity for learning and the way your career path, your trajectory went from playing in the Air Force Band to deciding that you wanted to pursue this path. Can you talk about that?
I mean, I think it's interesting that a lot of musicians tend to think that performance is the route. Performance is the way to go. It's the thing that a lot of people find the most happiness with, and I don't know whether this is on purpose, but it seems to be the career that is held above all other music careers for most people. Not everybody, but most people. And what I found, even in my young professional life, was that having that be the main part of my career wasn't ever going to make me happy in the way that I saw other people like you being happy. So I knew that I wanted to play, but I like to teach. I really do like to teach. And I was in the Air Force Band for a couple of years. Interesting job. I liked it for the most part. I got a lot out of it and enjoyed a lot of the people. But that gig in particular didn't really allow me to expand my teaching capacity. It was really just because of the schedule. I mean, the people there would have been fine if I had taken more teaching work, but it's a job that takes a lot of time, and they need you available to do Air Force-y things a lot. And so I missed expanding my teaching, and I decided to give up that gig and go get a PhD down at UT.
Give up a premier gig.
Yeah, those are good jobs.
Right.
I mean, it's...
So tell us a little bit about your trajectory from Juilliard to Air Force to Austin.
Ooh, okay, big bullet points. Juilliard, interesting place. My understanding of Juilliard, the way that I felt when I was there, was that it was built more for people that played like you and less for people that played like me.
What do you mean?
By that I mean, maybe you take issue with this. When I heard you play as a young person, I felt like, oh, that guy is fully formed. Like you had the mechanics, or you at least to me appeared to have the mechanics of the instrument kind of settled. And you were programming and working on expression and working on these sort of higher order things where I just couldn't make the noises right. Like I couldn't make the right vibrations at the right frequencies. Very fundamental issues I had.
That's interesting. I mean,
I know, because I'm going to guess that you're going to disagree with that.
We've had little, conversations about this, but it's funny because I would say maybe to a fault, my practicing is a little overbalanced in the side of the mechanics and trying to discover new efficiencies and discover new paths forward. And I've talked to. If you were to think in your mind of all your most favorite principal solo orchestral players who to you don't think about the mechanics at all, right? And they pick up the horn and they can sing through the horn, right? I've talked to some of those players and I've asked them this question, and they tell me a lot of them are only focusing on the mechanics in the practicing, right? And if you think about it, they have so many performances where that side of their mindset is being exercised, that performance-based mindset. And so their opportunity for finding those new efficiencies are in the practice room. And what we see, it makes it seem like they never think about these things because they're just naturally, gifted. So that was, never. I still feel like I'm really trying to discover, use all my energy to discover new pathways. And often a lot of that work is mechanical. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I think one of the ways that I've started describing that thing is that practice. Which the older we get, the bigger portion of our lives is taken up by practice. I mean, yes, you're on stage sometimes, and yes, you're teaching sometimes, but really most of our musical lives are essentially in a room alone working on stuff. And that's like the dark matter of the musical universe, that it is responsible for most of the learning. And we almost never look at it directly to see how it actually works. Because, yeah, I think a lot of people hear the greatest musicians alive and we just think, oh, they're amazing. And we don't get to see how it is that they make that happen. But that's later. Let's talk about practice later.
Well, practice is an intensely personal thing too, right?
Maybe. I mean, I think we do consider it personal, and it does, I think, at especially higher levels of expertise, I think a lot of musicians consider it proprietary. I mean, I ask musicians to share their practice with me a lot. Like, that's a pretty regular question. I want to see people's practice. I got to look at my numbers, but I think only about a third of the professional musicians I ask actually are comfortable sharing their practice.
Even you, nice guy like you.
Oh, yeah. I think because it's where people sound less than their best.
Right.
And we are, I think, to the detriment of all of our well-beings, I think we are taught to have a little bit of shame about that. A little bit of guilt, a little bit of like, I don't want anybody to hear me sound unpolished.
Right.
Where I think that's not doing anybody a service, because the unpolished part is, in my opinion, the most important part of what's happening with the learning, and to embrace that in a way that's a little more holistic and a little bit better representative of what we all go through.
Right.
Nobody is perfect. We end up hearing these really polished performances, especially now with social media, where editing can play a bigger role in that. But we are not nearly as often curious enough about what actually leads to that. What's all the stuff that allows that to happen.
So when you think about it, these people that have allowed you this inside look, they're quite generous to let you do that.
It's so humbling.
Yeah.
I mean, every time somebody shares a video of their practice with me, it just feels like a gift. Like, it really feels like they're opening up a sort of door to their process that a lot of people aren't comfortable with. So, Juilliard, I thought it was for people like you. I felt like I was working hard there and not improving. If I was improving, it was definitely not at the pace of my peers. I injured myself at the end of that. I got a pharyngocele, which, ready? Okay, here's my party trick.
Oh, zoom in. Cameraman. We don't have a camera. It's just
We'll do it in post.
It'll be magic.
So I had a thing. Actually, Brian McWhorter has had it as well. Another friend of mine, Mike Bosch, in the Air Force Band,
What is it called again?
A pharyngocele.
Okay.
If you're interested, you can check. I have a couple of things on my website about it. I thought it was career-ending because it was painful at the time. It ended up not being career-ending. I just needed to take a lot of time off and essentially relearn how to play the instrument at the age of 24-ish.
Wow.
An amazing experience. Very, very humbling to start over from scratch, having been, a relatively skilled musician, to go back to, I don't know how any of this works, which I think is super interesting for anybody that wants to teach well. It's oftentimes, especially when people get to do things as well as you do, it's easy to not remember what it's like to be a beginner or somebody who's struggling with stuff, because that's such an integral part of at the early stages of learning. And the more advanced you get at a thing, the further you get from those beginner experiences. So to get to have the opportunity to revisit and sort of rebuild as a musician.
Were you able to appreciate it in the moment, though?
Absolutely not. No, I hated it. I mean, it was so frustrating. It was almost all frustration. Yeah. Almost all of it. I mean, I was probably practicing 3 to 5 hours a day.
Right.
A lot of the Mike Sachs fundamental book, a lot of like very basic stuff. Not that that's a basic book, it's a lovely book. Everybody should read it, play it. But I wasn't doing anything advanced.
Yeah.
And spending that much time on the early stages of stuff was maddening.
I wonder, trumpet players by nature were not very patient. But how much of that inability to get through that initial frustration impacts our, potential for learning?
Yeah, I probably a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a few things to consider there. It's like how do you respond when you confront what appears to be a challenge that you can't overcome? And, there are a few responses there. You can do, what is the definition of insanity? You can keep doing the thing that you've been doing that doesn't get you past that barrier or over the obstacle or whatever it is. Or you can change or you can give up, I guess. But, we want to expand what we can do, especially I don't know, trumpet players are unique in this, but we want to be better now. But I think it's important to say there's a lot of learning value in continuing to confront challenges and not giving up on them. It's not hitting them so hard with so much regularity and so much frustration that you quit.
Right.
But being willing to and being curious enough in your own development to continually nudge up against that and be curious. I'll tell you a story about Bob Duke. Bob Duke is a colleague of ours at UT. Probably the smartest guy, smartest human I think I've ever really interacted with. We were doing some eye tracking research a couple of years ago with a couple of other PhD students that are all smarter than me. They're amazing humans. And we were dealing with this hardware software issue with these glasses and the software that we were using to do eye tracking. And there was so much error, and it was so confusing as to why the error was arising and what to do about it. How could we take these huge data sets that we had and turn them into something meaningful? And I remember being in a room with these 3 PhD colleagues of mine and Bob, and we were just trying stuff. Nothing was working. And I was ready to pull like the remaining hairs out of my head. I was so mad, like fuming, sweating. And Bob, we would go through a thing and try another solution. And when it didn't work, Bob would just go, what happens if we change this? And he was just curious about it.
That's just natural disposition, huh?
Yeah, that what we had done was essentially eliminated one option. So we're closer to figuring out what's actually going on. And that sort of open-mindedness, the curiosity to see how a human that's that smart learns. Like, how curious are they? What do they do when things don't go like they're supposed to?
Chris Coletti's like that.
Oh,
yeah.
It's so cool to see. Right. I'm jealous.
Yeah, and it's not just about music. It's amazing to be around that level of creativity and curiosity about everything, and it just puts a positive light on the whole process of learning. Yeah.
I mean, Chris is just such a lovely human to be around. How could you not enjoy being around Chris Coletti? Yeah. So I relearned the instrument. While I was relearning the instrument, I got a master's degree in education. So I have always loved teaching. I can, at this point in my life and my career, I can say unequivocally that I enjoy teaching more than playing. It brings me more joy. It brings me more humanity, helping people do stuff better and to make music more expressively. And that's just, those are my happy times. Being up with a spotlight on me, trying to play the trumpet, less happy times. So I did some teaching, and then I hung out in New York for about a decade after school doing the New York thing, which is always some vibrant mix of playing, teaching, and other stuff, the general category of administration, but that means, scheduling and recording and all sorts of stuff. Yeah. And then really for like adult reasons, I took the Air Force job. I mean, I hadn't taken an audition in a decade, maybe. And insurance sounded sexy. Like, miss health insurance and some stability. And so the way that I did it, I opened up the union paper when I sort of decided I was going to take an audition. Then there were 2 trumpet auditions happening at the time that were advertised in the physical paper. One was for Chicago Lyric, and the other was for the Air Force Band. And they happened on like the same day or the same time period. And I thought I was going to game the system. I figured like a lot of the players I know are going to go take that Lyric audition. Yeah. I'm going to go sneak in and see if I can just go ahead and get this military band job. And I did. And stayed there for 5 years, played principal in the concert band for about 3 of them, I think. Musically, I enjoyed it a lot more than I was ready to. I mean, I was a New Yorker, so you're playing always really interesting stuff in New York. And I thought, I'm going to go be in a band. I'd never been in a band, like a wind band, since high school. Right. Actually, there's one recording. There's a Juilliard Wind Ensemble conducted by our teacher, Mark Gould, that you should check out. But I had never really done band, and so I didn't know what to expect. But honestly, as a trumpet player, band music's fun. I mean, there's just a lot of playing. Right. I got to play a fair amount of sort of jazz stuff. Like I played with the Airmen a Note for a while when they were out of a player. yeah, I enjoyed a lot of the music a lot more than I was ready to, which was interesting for me. But then like I said, I miss teaching, and I wanted to learn more about how it is that people get good at stuff. I mean, that's our program in music and human learning at UT. It's my PhD is not in musicology. It's not in performance. It's in music and human learning. And the idea there is that really, really great teaching can emerge if you have a really good understanding of how it is that humans actually learn. I mean, we oftentimes as teachers, we think about teaching as sort of the stuff we say and, the way that we communicate with students. But what we in our program like to think about is the quality of your teaching is best judged by how good your students are getting, how much better your students are getting at the thing you're trying to get them to do. And so we go through a couple of years of coursework on, neuroscience and cognitive science and behaviorism, and we learn as much as we can as musicians, because I'm still a trumpet player. We learn as much as we can about the mechanisms of human behavior and how to manipulate those mechanisms to make learning happen, to get people better at stuff. And in our particular world, it's perceptual motor skills, how it is we get better at doing stuff. And that's what I studied for a couple of years at UT.
So tell us a little bit about the details of that process.
Well, I think... So it's important to say that, and I don't think it's said often enough amongst musicians, that getting better at music is actually getting better at moving. It's fine to study and analyze dots on a page. It's lovely to listen to music and enjoy the way it sounds. But if you want to play music, anything beyond, just pure electronic stuff where you're just literally programming, anything in the acoustic world, you have to make a movement or engage your nervous system in a way that causes vibration. And for us in the wind and brass world, we do some of this and we engage kind of that and probably some of this and maybe some of this or this. Right. And really the story of us getting better at that is the story of us coordinating those movements in ways that allow us to make more music the way we think music should sound. And I think it's conversely both a far more complex story than a lot of musicians are ready to, or I don't want to say ready to. It's a far more complex story than a lot of musicians tell themselves about how they get good. But it's also kind of a simpler story. Like there's not a lot of veering off into opinion and mythology and mystery. And we've talked about, pedagogy, the way a lot of teachers think about pedagogy is kind of opinion. It's like, right. Or here's what I've noticed about my own playing, or maybe here's what I've noticed works with a few of my students. But what we look to sort of reveal is the fundamentals of human behavior that allow all of that to happen. So it's no longer guesswork about what might actually get the student better. It's, no, here's how we can structure experiences and design things over time so that they do get better at accomplishing their musical goals. But that particular thing is, one of the most, I want to say mysterious, one of the sort of harder to understand, because it happens below conscious awareness, processes that governs how we get better at movement is this use of prediction. And, the human brain is essentially a giant prediction machine. There's I think a very compelling case to be made that the reason we're alive right now is because our brains are really good at knowing what's probably going to happen next. And that most of our behavior is essentially governed by that ability to predict really well. And it does all sorts of stuff. Like, it's the reason why you and I are not paying attention to the walls and the color of the things and the sound in the room that's happening, that's not me talking. Because our brain doesn't need to pay attention to that stuff. It doesn't move, it doesn't change. What we pay attention to is the stuff that changes. But when we want to move in the world and we want to get better at moving, our brain's got to create what's called a motor command or a motor plan. And that's essentially a really complicated set of instructions for everything below the spine to do. And there's one of my favorite books, A Neuroscience of Expertise. That's such a dorky book. But in it, this guy, Marim Bilalik, I'm sure I'm not doing that name justice, but he says, in order to help us appreciate the complexity of human movement, I don't know if I said this in the class or not, but there's roughly 600 muscles in the human body. And if we grossly oversimplify what every one of those muscles does as either being off or on, right? That's generally there's a continuum of stuff that happens in between there. But if we simplify that to off or on, that means that when our brain wants to create a motor command or a motor plan, a set of instructions for our body to do, it's got to choose from a bank of options that is 2 to the power of 600, which is an astronomically big number. I think it's more atoms than there are in the universe. And that's for everything we do at every moment of waking life, that our brain is creating these incredibly complicated, mind-bogglingly complicated instructions for us to do everything we do successfully. So it's monumentally hard. Just really, it's a difficult thing to wrap your brain around. But it's doing this all the time. And so while it does that, it creates what in the jargony word is an efference copy. So the way that our brain navigates the world is it creates a motor plan, and then it makes a prediction about the way that motor plan should look, feel, taste, all the perceptual systems. So it's a set of predicted perceptual feedback. So we've got what we actually do, and then we've got what the brain predicted was going to happen. And the brain calculates whether or not those two things are the same, whether they match or whether there's a mismatch. And if it's a match, it's great. Everything golden. Most of what we do in our days as adults are matches, right? We walk successfully, we eat successfully, we play the trumpet successfully sometimes. But as far as learning goes, the mismatch is really that's where we want a lot of our attention, because that mismatch gives us the most valuable information we can get about what we need to change in order to make that mismatch go away. So to bring this back into the music world, if you go to play, a high C on the trumpet, and a B flat comes out, which, happens. Yeah. There's a mismatch between what you intended to happen, what your brain predicted would happen, and what actually happened. And so if you were going to go back and fix that and make it so that the high C did come out, you would need to change something about what you did in order to make the prediction align with what actually happened. Right. And that story of making the mismatch go away, essentially, is how learning works.
2 questions. In our practice, bring it back to practicing, how often should we be experiencing mismatches in order to optimize learning? And then the second one is, someone at your level, as when you've been developing your ear and getting more and more detailed models, right, over years, you're going to basically evaluate an attempt as a mismatch way more often than a younger student who doesn't have that refined ear and refined detailed models, right? So is there something to be said for the curse of a good ear, you know what I mean, in terms of achieving those matches?
No. And the best thing I can point people to is there's a study done by, and I've mentioned this a few times in things that I've done in the past couple of weeks, but there's a great study by Lonnie Hamilton. She did her PhD with us at UT. She now teaches at UMKC. She's an incredible human. She did this amazing study a couple of years ago where she asked string players to practice. And there were 4 groups of string players. There were high school students, undergraduate students, graduate students, and then artist level people, like the Moreau Quartet, I think, did it, the folks at UT. And she asked them all to practice for 10 minutes, just whatever they normally practice. And then right after that session, I think it was 10 minutes, she asked them to listen back with headphones to what they had just done and to push a space bar every time they heard any sound that they made that they didn't intend to play. So essentially a mistake. So push the space bar when you heard yourself make a mistake. And what she found, which I think is worth a real deep think for anybody that wants to get good at stuff, is that those 4 groups of individuals push that button at about the same rate. And what that means is that what counts as an error for artist level musicians is not the same as what counts as an error for a high school musician. But error is a required part of getting better at a thing. It's why artist level musicians like you are still able to improve. No, even though you sound as good as you do, you still get better because you have this really developed idea of how you really want to sound. So I would hesitate to call it a curse only because it's that exact thing that drives the ability to keep improving no matter how good you are. I think the thing to be really scared about is if you stop hearing those differences. Yeah. It's when in that study, if people didn't push the space bar,
right,
that means that you're doing everything exactly as you want to, and that sounds like a lovely thing, but as somebody who studies learning, what that means is that you're not learning. You're not changing anymore.
Wow. Yeah.
How are you going to do it differently? Right. Because everything you're doing is what you mean for it to be.
Right.
So I think young people or new students or younger students, they do have a more rudimentary idea of how music should sound than you do. But to go back to your original question, I think really when practicing, most of the sounds you make should be exactly what you want to make. There's some pretty good data to suggest that that's when the best learning happens.
Okay. And
it sort of makes intuitive sense, right? Because if you're playing something and everything's going wrong, right, like if you go to play a phrase and you miss everything, like rhythm's wrong, you're not phrasing it right, it's out of tune, then you have kind of a conundrum, because where do you start? What do you do? I mean, that kind of ends up being what I refer to as practice triage.
Right.
Where it's like, oh, God, I don't know, I guess I clap out the rhythm. Let me do that. Right? Let me do a da, 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 da. But, so we're not sure what we can do with something that's going all the wrong.
Right.
What we could do is bring it back to something that we can do mostly right.
Yeah.
And what that allows us to do, it allows our brains to pay a lot of attention to one thing or two things or a small number of things that are manageable that we can get really great in the short term.
Yeah.
So we should all be, it seems like, the data is, a little squirrely with this stuff, but it seems like there's really good reason to believe that we should all be playing a lot more sounds in the practice room that are exactly the way we intend to.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just thinking about, okay, the player that's watching, maybe it's a trumpet player, maybe it's a brass player, maybe it's not. And they, to themselves, are saying, yeah, I agree with all this. What happens when there's some barrier, and you and I have kind of briefly talked about this a little bit. I want to dig in a little bit.
Okay.
What happens when there's some kind of barrier where I'm trying to progress in a certain aspect of my playing, but it's just like a brick wall that I can't break through, and no matter how much I think about air, or no matter how much I listen to Phil Smith, I'm not absorbing his ease and efficiency, right? It's like, and in that aspect, is it possible that maybe a habit that you've developed, or a way that your body knows of accomplishing these motor tasks, or even a strength that you have, is also contributing to this, this kind of hurdle in your playing? And how do you break through that? Like, I know a lot of players who struggle with this, and they would say, yes, like, I know that I can't keep approaching my high range or my articulation the same way, because that's insanity. But there's so much fear because I don't know which one of these paths to take, whether it's pivoting or mouthpiece pressure, or like maybe I should just think about the clouds when I play. And there's a little bit of paralysis by not knowing which path to take, and fear that if they take one path, it's going to be the wrong path, and maybe all these strengths that they have, even though they're trying to focus on this aspect of weakness in their playing, maybe all the strengths are going to dissipate because they're taking this path in order to achieve this goal that they have, but unintentionally they're saying goodbye to their strengths as well. Yeah. That's a lot, but
that is a lot.
What do you do when you don't know what to do?
It's a good question. The first thing is, I think it's important just for our own well-being to embrace the idea that the path from total beginner to sound like Caleb Hudson is not linear.
Just replace that with Matthias Hofsson.
Okay, yeah. I think it's for people that haven't traversed the path that you and Matthias have traversed, it's easy for us to think that every day you just get, 0.2% better, and that's been the story of your life, and then now you sound as good as you do. In fact, it's a jagged line, especially early in the thing. We have huge, variations in how good we sound day to day, month to month. When you get to my age, year to year, like I say I can say this with complete honesty, that I've had years of not getting better at the instrument. I've gone literally, it's like Chris Gecker mentions that in his articulation book, right? That you can go a long time and not get better at single tonguing. And so he suggests this, this sort of path that you can take to get your single tongue faster. But so just know that is how it works. So that it's not as if you're expected to be 4% better tomorrow than you were today. That there will be steps down and back and loops around in weird ways. So it's to take what we can do and jostle it. Like the way that I think about practice, like we come into the room with this sort of gelatinous blob of stuff we can do well. Yeah. And it changes moment to moment and day to day. So it's not like a hard thing. It's sort of blobby. And our job in any given practice session is to take that blob and add another sliver of stuff. We sort of move that stuff around so that we can do all the stuff we could do yesterday with just a little bit more. But that sometimes is really tricky to do when we're making major changes to how we do stuff. Like if there is a true barrier, like no matter how hard I try, I cannot hit a D above the staff. Right. That was the story of my 4 years at Juilliard. There was nothing I could do.
That's a lot of brass pedagogy. Is that just like listen and blow and use your air and everything will solve itself. And if it's not solving itself, you're not meant to do this.
Oh, and
I've heard this.
That's exactly what I took in. It was that you're not good enough. You're not a good enough musician. And Phil, just to be clear, Phil never told me that.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh, he would never. I don't know. Maybe thought that, but he never told me that. But that was the sort of implicit lesson of all that stuff. It's like if you're working really hard and you can't figure this stuff out, this isn't meant for you. Right. And I think that is tragedy is probably a pretty heavy word, but there's a cost to that. And I think a lot of people stop playing music, not even just stop progressing toward a career. I think a lot of people genuinely stop playing music because they don't feel like they're good enough to get better. And I mean, that's where great teaching comes in. And part of that, as you know, is in a studio setting, helping students feel safe enough to explore. Right. Like, here's what I do. Here's what I would suggest you try. Give it a try. Right. Like, let's just see. There's got to be a little more tinkering. I think when you're making physical changes, you've got to be led by curiosity. Right. So I would say, I don't know, my bullet pointed answer is know that learning isn't linear. Yeah. It gets there eventually. Like we were just talking earlier today about you have a concert coming up in 6 days. And you know how to get from where you are to where you need to be in those 6 days. Right. Because that's a big reason why you play the way you play. But for younger students especially, be willing to have great days and bad days. Yeah. That's part of it. That's a normal, natural part of it. It's fine. And the second is just to be far more curious. And essentially, you want to begin to map. One of my colleagues, Amy Simmons, has a nice little brain thing where she says neurons that fire together wire together. Mm-hmm. And so what that means is that if you have thousands of iterations of doing a thing and doing this action and this outcome comes out. And I'll use my own life for this. When I tried to play a high D and a high C comes out. Tried to play a high D and a high C comes out. So my brain has a lot of these learned experiences that have not led me to do this thing. And this barrier that you're talking about is the space between those two things. Yeah. And so the cleanest way, although it's not genuinely a satisfying way to do it, is to go back to something that is comfortable and easy and even and build a new pathway to the hard thing. It's not to continually attempt the hard thing. And this is really where some of my research comes in, that the word that Bob and I use is doableize. That what we see beautiful musicians, expert musicians do constantly in practice. They confront undoable passages of music. There's a barrier. It's a small barrier, but they come across a passage of music that they can't currently play the way they want to. That is the barrier. That's the same barrier that I had. Yeah. But you have it when you pick up music that you're learning. And what great musicians almost always do, they take that hard thing and they immediately modify it into something they can do beautifully, really quick. They don't just continually try the thing that's hard and impossible for them. They immediately change the task into something they can do and then they build in all the different steps to get them to where they want to be.
Right.
So when I was a junior in college trying to play a high D, I didn't go back far enough to something I could do in a relaxed, easy, reliable way and build a new pathway. I just kept trying the high D.
Yeah.
So you got to build new behaviors. And building new behaviors is possible. It's eminently possible. You just need to have a couple of things in place. And one of the hardest ones for people is to leap back to something they can do beautifully, accurately, reliably every single time. That big step, I see very few novice learners doing on a regular basis. And I see every expert musician do all of the time. Yeah. They do it so regularly, they don't even know they do it. They can't even really tell the story about it.
So does it come with the personal maturing? Does it come with an enhanced, musicality? Is it a combination of those things?
Typically now, yeah. But I am a firm believer that it can be taught. And there are a few students I'm working with now where essentially I've got this really just spectacular 7th grade student that I've been working with online for a couple of years. And at this point, he essentially, he can play something. And if it doesn't go the way he wants it to, all I have to say is, hey, did that sound the way you wanted it to? And he would say, no. And I would say, well, what's your move now? And then he goes, well, let me simplify it into something I can play. And
how old?
7th grade.
Okay.
And so this is the land of practice strategies, right? Like we often talk about techniques of practicing that, you can slow it down or take it down an octave or sing it or listen to Phil Smith play it. Or, we have these sort of list of things that we can do.
Right.
But all of those things, if they're going to be successful, they all doabilize. They all make an undoable task possible in the near term.
Right. I see a lot of students, they crave this kind of prescribed checklist from their teacher when they don't realize that what they need to do is take ownership of that process.
Oh, yeah.
Because the process is, and I would even say, when a student, I'm curious to hear what you think about this. When I have a student that, has a little bit of a breakthrough and they have a successful iteration of whatever they're working on in a lesson, that next go at it is the most important, because all of a sudden they have this like rush of adrenaline and this they would just want to recreate that moment of euphoria, right? Uh-huh. And they'll do whatever they can to recreate that, and they kind of forget the process that they just undertook in order to achieve that. So it's like right after they have success, sometimes it falls apart. And that's where you really need to engage and be even more kind of objective, curious about the process.
What is it? What did you do differently that time? I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting that you use the word drug, because it is a drug. I mean, that's essentially a dopamine release. That if you've been working hard for something and it's not going the way you want it to, and then it does,
right?
That's the reward structure in the brain that allows us to recreate things. That it makes it a reinforcing thing. Yeah. It makes us want to continually get that same high of like, whoa, that was awesome.
Right.
But it's also, it's interesting that like it's a pretty common response to that. Like when you're working for a thing and then you do it once, and a lot of students will actually just move on from that. Like they'll think, oh, I got it. It's like, no, you don't.
When you studied the professional practicing, what did those people do when they got it?
That's a good question, because I think it varies. I can think of 2 people, and I won't name here, that do that very, consistently. That once they get something, they repeat it over and over. They'll do a lot of successful iterations, and a lot of people that don't. I think at a certain level of musicianship and sort of maturity, life happens, and you've only got a small amount of time to practice. Yeah. I mean, as you know, you get some kids and you have jobs, and you no longer have 4 flexible free hours to do whatever you want in a room. Like, so you people that play at the level that you do, there's a trust of like, oh, okay, that's how I did it. Let me get that again. Okay, good. I know I can do that now. But for young people that are expanding what they can do and that don't really know what they can do, what they do in the practice room is going to be different than what they're going to do when they're rehearsing, is going to be slightly different than what they're going to do when they're on stage, where you have a better understanding of that landscape. Younger learners don't. So for them, you're right. The move should be, that went great. Now do it 10 more times. Make it sound just like that 10 more times. And that is hard. and sometimes frustrating for students to like, well, but I just did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the goal isn't for that to be just something you can do. The goal is for that to be the thing you do.
Exactly. It's something that's interesting to me is when I look at my students, there's a lot of diversity in terms of their performance gap. And what I mean by that is their consistent level of execution in the practice room compared to in a performance setting in front of their peers or in a recital setting. And it's not always, it's actually, a lot of time it's not related to their levels. So I'll have students that can play exactly the way they play on stage as the practice room, and they're maybe not at the top of the studio.
Right.
But then I'll have a couple of my top skilled students, maybe even master students, and there's quite a performance gap.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've seen that, if you have any, what do you attribute that to? And how does that play into like how much you basically repeat that phrase that you got 10 times, or do you know that because you just have a more consistent level of execution on stage that you don't have to do it as much?
I think it's super common, and I think as we get better at a thing, that becomes, we identify as being better at it, and so it's more fraught to get up in front of other humans and be not great. So there's more weight to it. The performance nerves are real, and that gap is, I think, very well studied. I mean, Noah, the Bulletproof Musician, he's got a lot of stuff about this, and the thing that I would suggest we all think a little bit more about is how we as teachers, how we can cultivate and design more happy performance experiences for our students. Because essentially, for a student that has a major gap, their attention is being diverted when they get on stage. It's no longer on the music making, it's on other stuff, or sometimes it goes way in, like the attention can focus in on like, what's my bottom lip doing? It's like, if you're thinking about your bottom lip when you're starting Mahler 5, it's going to be a rough hour. Oh gosh. Oh no. But so what we want to do at all levels of study and teaching is to help students essentially in like a Pavlovian way. We want them to pair performance with happy outcomes. And oftentimes what that means is lots more informal performances, lots more, especially at earlier stages of learning. Bless the state we're in, Texas. It is unfortunately, I think, a common feature of a lot of music learning, especially at the high school level, that there's a lot of work that's put into very occasional high magnitude events. Yeah. Like marching band or even concert band, where they'll sit and they'll learn 3 pieces for 4 months, right. And they go and have one show, and that show essentially defines how good the band is. And I think that's a problem. I think that what students end up learning is that they should get really nervous about performing because it's a big, big deal. But what the happiest musicians we know, performance is just it's a thing they do. You have some dinner, and then you go hang out with some people, and you go play a concert at night, and then you get up the next day and you do the same thing again. Yeah. It's not. I mean, there are occasional, there are performances that we all have that are bigger than others, but. Right. The point is to normalize it. Yeah. Essentially, just make it an everyday part of thing. I mean, Whiff Rudd does this spectacularly well. Yeah. Where his students, there's so much play in what he does with them up in Baylor, and there's so much. Okay, it's your turn. Now you do the thing. Okay, cool. Now it's my turn. I'll do the thing, and then now you two go. You do the thing, and they get a lot of opportunities to hear and interact with each other and perform for each other and laugh and. Right. So by the time you're a doctoral student, that's a thorny thing to unpack. But for any player or teacher that may be watching this, there's a lot that we can do with younger learners, a lot, right. To help, prepare them for a happy musical life. Right. Not just one where they're playing the right notes, but one where they're enjoying what they're doing. Right. I mean, I'll just admit that I took Inderall when I was young, and I got so hooked on it when I was an undergrad that I took it for lessons. Just lessons. Like I was so nervous about performing my best for Phil Smith, that I would, take a drug to take the edge off. And I think it was my junior or senior year, I just thought, like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? If that takes so much out of me, what's the point? I should really start to learn to enjoy this.
But I mean, it's interesting, but to be clear, like, you're not saying, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but you're not saying that you're ignoring the reality of a competitive landscape of the field that we're in, and the need for balance in, like, a teacher conveying that to the students, because that is a disservice to not convey the nature of, you need to be at this level of training.
Yeah.
But to do so in a way that is balanced and that always has as the foundation this joy of music making and collaborating. I remember being at Juilliard. I don't know if you have this experience, but, like, just trying to get players to do chamber music, and trombone players especially. No, I have to go practice the Ride of the Valkyries 100 times.
It's gonna take away from my Berlioz.
I just, that was like the prevalent mindset that I experienced.
Yeah.
And I was just so lucky to, like, form a brass motet and find like-minded players. And I think any institution you're in, you have to find those like-minded musicians. How much of that is, rubs off on your mindset, being surrounded by people that are accuracy-based and, like, intimidation-based?
Yeah. Well, man, that's a big one. I mean, the accuracy-based thing I find particularly maddening, because essentially that's creating a dichotomy that doesn't exist in music. The idea that somehow playing things right should be prioritized above playing them beautifully I think that's a false narrative. Yeah. That what we're driven by. I mean, from a behaviorist, from just a brain behavior perspective, we're driven by our version of how we want to be. And we were talking about, how you want music to sound earlier. And, the greatest musicians are not just envisioning playing the right notes at the right time with the right articulation, the right dynamic. The greatest musicians are imagining all the expressive qualities of music from the very beginning of learning it. It's not as if you sit down and are going to go pick up and learn a new piece, and the first thing you do is, like, count out the rhythms. 1 knee and a 2 and a 3 and 4. No. You look at the thing and immediately you've got an idea of phrase shape, and you know how you want to articulate each one of these and how it fits into the character. So this idea of playing things right before you make them beautiful, strongly disagree.
Yeah, you can't segment your approach in that way, right?
But there's so much working against music students that makes them think that that's a thing. I mean, one of my favorite sort of straw man arguments, it's not an argument, I'm sort of setting it up to knock it down, is, like, number one in every band book is always just, like, rumble around a B flat for 4 beats. So you just go and you stop and you take a big breath. Hopefully it goes again, and we're,
that's the thumbnail for the video, by the way.
And we talk to 11-year-olds or 10-year-olds and say, like, that's music. No, it's not. You're rumbling at about 4 beats. And so we end up teaching them for many years sometimes that the important thing is to make a noise for about the right amount of time. And that's music. No. So I think, surrounding yourself with people that are willing to see music as a higher art form than just doing things correctly. Right. Because at that point, I mean, what's the best case scenario? If you think music should be right above all else, best case scenario for you is that you're going to get a great job that is incredibly boring for you. That's best. Is that you'll be the one who can make all of the right noises at all the right times, and then you will be done as if you finished music.
Well, just to be clear, it'll be incredibly boring for me or you to listen to, but maybe for them it won't be, because that, right? I mean,
you're right.
We know players, right?
Exactly. I'm thinking of one person who I think is incredibly happy playing just like that, and I know he does that in his life, and I think he's very fulfilled by it. Yeah. But you're right. For me, and presumably for you, right, that's not enough. I mean,
I think Coletti calls it like artists versus car mechanics or technicians. You know,
Yeah.
It's like there's a lot of technicians out there.
Yeah.
And you can make a living that way, right?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think the orchestral audition scene is essentially designed to, elicit that from young players, especially the best young players for whom that is a career option. That, as I understand it, and I haven't taken an orchestral audition in a while, as I understand it, the idea is to go in there and play everything kind of right and relatively bland. Even if you have more interesting ideas for what you would do with that music, you don't do it in an audition because very few people, maybe only at the highest level, want to hear your voice in an American orchestra audition. That doesn't need to be a part of it, right? It's not as if you can go in there and Ornette Coleman your way through an orchestral music career.
Right.
But I think there's so much value in integrating the expressive qualities of your music into your goal for how you want to sound, and moment to moment, day to day, month to month. That separating out right from that is, I think, an academic exercise that is not likely to make you a better musician or a happier human.
Yeah.
But surround yourself with people that also agree with that, I think. Yeah. Although I learned a lot hanging out with the trombone players, and they were a special breed. Presumably, I mean, Joe's still there, so it can't be too different. Like how much into their tone they got was interesting to me. When the trumpet studio at Juilliard, when I was there, there was like Billy Hunter, David Gordon. There were these orchestra guys, orchestra people, and they were, they had wide tones and could big fat articulations. And then there was a guy named David Gluck. Did you ever meet David?
No.
He's an Israeli guy. He plays the Scherzer piccolo. It's like really small, pointed sound, like totally different idea of how to play the trumpet than those folks. And then there was C.J. Camerari, who came in there with kind of like a different, more sort of personal, kind of jazz-ish, improvisatory perspective on it. Like the way he was playing was so different than the orchestra folks. But the trombone community there was a lot more homogenized. Like they were all tone, blocky stuff, and it was kind of interesting to hang out with them and be like, oh man, you guys are really thinking hard about that. Okay, maybe I should do that too. Didn't really work for me, but it was cool just to watch them do it. And I mean, most of them work.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a studio there. Those folks got jobs.
Right.
Most of them.
Right.
So I don't know.
But I mean, all the people you just named, like, man,
that's true.
What a great diversity of artistic voice.
Yeah.
CJ with Y music and
Yeah.
all the stuff he's doing.
Yeah.
And Billy Hunter and Dave Gordon in Seattle. It's crazy.
I was really happy that at least in the trumpet studio there was that diversity of approaches. At least that there were people that were not terribly interested in being principal orchestral trumpet players.
Yeah,
there were a lot of folks that just wanted to, do interesting stuff. Charlie Porter was there. Goodness.
Oh, cool.
I mean, he's like an alien. Like he can do any of it, and he could and did, and he just went to go make music in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was a blessing. I always liked hanging out with the dancers. I mean, I did the choreo comp was a class where you could collaborate with the dancers and the composers. And I always thought the dancers were the ones that were thinking about stuff in the most interesting ways. And my friends that were dancers, I don't know, I remember attributing it once, and I don't know if this is fair, but that their career path at Juilliard, they're not so much driven by audition success, and that's not really a part of how they were conceptualizing it then. They really saw dance as the art form, and they were just interested in expressing themselves in the highest way they could, in the most expressive way they could. And that was just so different than what the trombone or the tuba section was doing. So I liked them. They were interesting.
So I've seen your awesome Instagram clips. They're like these nuggets of golden information that can just guide your whole week or month of practicing. So I'm wondering if you can either give us some top pitfalls that you noticed in students, or on a positive spin you can say the top 5 habits of mind, or just give us some nuggets here.
Interesting.
Lightning round style.
Okay. And this is just what I've been thinking about a lot recently. I haven't tried to explain this in like a nugget style.
It's probably going to be the best one. Part of the video.
Contextualize your fundamentals. Okay, now, you're going to have to see my toes for this. Okay, maybe not. So the question I like to ask is, okay, well, let me see if there's a way that I can do this. Okay.
I can adjust the boom mic.
No, here we go. Am I getting any better at basketball right now? Not rhetorical.
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah. Do you think I'm getting any better at basketball?
Probably not.
Probably not. And yes, this sort of shooting mechanism is a fundamental part of how basketball works. Absolutely. I don't think anybody, my sister played basketball, should shoot like this. But whatever your shooting, pattern is, it'd be really difficult to play basketball without a good, I guess I should probably follow through a little bit.
Now you're getting better.
Yeah, now I'm getting better. There you go. But the reason this isn't getting me any better is because there's no ball and no hoop. I get no feedback about how this action is actually leading to better basketball.
Okay.
And yet, the breathing gym exists. And I've worked with students who have spirometers and bread bags that they blow up. And we isolate fundamentals to away from the context of music making in ways that make them fundamentally meaningless. So if you're going to practice stuff like breathing or maybe even long tones, really think carefully about how that thing that you're working on does or does not resemble what you actually want to end up doing. Okay. If you're just playing long tones to play long tones and you want to play, like Clifford Brown, you got to really rethink, or you got to think carefully about how that thing that you're working on is related to the thing you actually want to do. That's maybe another thing. I should make a video about this because I'll have
really quickly
4 minutes to explain it when I've thought about it.
I said lightning round, but I'm gonna dig in because I want you to explain. So long tones. How have you seen a wrong approach to long tones negatively impact somebody?
It's not necessarily that it'd be wrong or negatively impact. I think what the way we can think about our practice activities is, are they a waste of time? There are ways that you can damage yourself during practice, but I actually don't see a lot of students doing that. The worst thing I see students do or hear students do is reinforcing bad habits. And that's not necessarily harmful, but it's not getting you any better. You're wasting time. And time is fixed, and so improving your practice efficiency is about getting more out of whatever time you got. So it's not like practicing long tones would ever be damaging. Never mind. I can't imagine people practicing long tones like the Claude Gordon book. I don't know if you've ever seen that book where it's just like athletic, But the idea would be that if you want to work on let me ask you, what are the benefits of working on a long tone or working on long tones?
Yeah, sure. Well, the goals that I would keep in mind, it depends on how you do them, would be prioritizing flow over accuracy in terms of the response. So whether you're tonguing or air attacking, those have different goals, right? Developing a nice balanced tone. Håkan Hardenberger talks about like the bow to the string, like getting the perfect balance, and I like to think about that when I'm doing. I don't do long tones like I did when I was in 5th grade, 6th grade. I kind of just do flow, Chicowicz stamp kind of things now.
And isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
For me, that's the big thing. Is I think we teach young people to just sustain noise for a period of time,
right? And
that will magically get you better. And I'm probably paraphrasing a lot of bad teaching right there, but essentially just holding a tone in and of itself has value. And I disagree with that. I think really the way that most music that we play as trumpet players is not that. Sustain a noise for a particular period of time. So I think moving is better than staying. Resonance is the key, and you want to have resonance. But the reason why the Chicowicz and the stamp and those are so widely used rather than just is because they have motion. Even in the Mike Sachs book that starts off with these long tones, he even suggests you doing the sort of hairpin even early on in your practice day because of that. I compare that with sort of the Claude Gordon or sort of the earlier stuff like the Arbins, but even Caruso in a way, like this just sustain with no motion at all, is just not reflective of what trumpet players generally do on the instrument. So I think adding movement, adding flow, always going to be, or almost always going to be a nice thing. Time is a thing, adding dynamics, adding shape. These are all things that can be integrated into sustaining long tones and working on resonance and articulation and stuff. So that's what I mean by contextualizing them. That if you really want to make your practice concise, efficient, get the most out of it, try not to separate these isolated things as much and really find ways to bring them together and use them the way musicians do. Okay. Like, to me, breathing is an easier one to sort of make fun of, because if you're just breathing big, it's not really getting you better at the trumpet. So what would be better is just to breathe and then make a noise on the trumpet. And then you would know whether the breath you took was good at making you good at the trumpet or not. I mean, no offense to, Sam and
Sure.
Yeah, you go, Pat. Those guys are doing, they look like they were having fun. But I think that that essentially to me is like that's off the deep end of decontextualizing stuff. Maybe for tuba players, that's nice. But I think I'm always going to be telling the story about thinking about practice quality more than quantity. Stop measuring your practice in terms of minutes and hours. Start thinking about your practice in terms of how much better it got you. And you should notice improvement every single practice session. I mean, I know that goes against what we were talking about earlier with the jagged line, but the way we get that jagged line of learning to smooth out is by getting better at something every practice session, getting something great.
Yeah, so many of us start a practice day and automatically assign that day as either I'm feeling good or bad. And then our outcomes are maybe a result of that mindset, right? Because I've found that as I gotten older and a little bit more patient with myself, even when I'm feeling swollen after a long tour or whatever, I can still get back to at least a semblance of that efficiency, of my peak efficiency. And if I'm patient enough with myself, I can always find it, right?
Yeah.
If it just takes a little bit more patience, instead of just saying, well, today's a wasted day, I can't really make progress, let me just go through the motions and then put the horn away.
I mean, I think that sort of plugs into what a lot of people probably think, although I don't have data to suggest this, but that there's just a trust that doing the activities will make you better. Like, a lot of people talk about pedagogy as the things you play, rather than the order you play them in and how much better you get at them. And so there's this idea that like, oh, let me do stamp every day and then I'll be good. No. How are you playing the stamp? Right. What are you doing with the stamp? How are you changing your tone as you go through the registers? I think navigating that is really important. I think I have a sort of new angle for how I'm trying to think about stuff, and that's to increase the well-being. I think a lot of people have a relationship with practice that is not healthy. Even a lot of really advanced students, I think, tend to think about it as something they have to do, and not as something that is a happiness-inducing integrated part of their musical life. And I think helping people set and reach doable goals within a practice session, and that goes back to you. My guess is that when you pick up the trumpet and you got a really swollen face, you're not going to go try to learn a new H.K. Gruber piece that day. What you're going to do is you're going to structure your goals for the day so that they're more doable, given where you are in that particular moment.
Right.
And what you are excellent at doing, that a lot of trumpet players who haven't been on tour and had to do really hard stuff, is managing your goals for that day, given where you are. And so whether you feel like you're in a great place or a less great place, set a goal for the day or for that practice session that's doable. Yeah. That genuinely gets you better at something, even if it's just a 2-bar phrase. I need to work out like when I'm feeling awful, finger things seem to me to be the easiest stuff to work out. Like, oh, let me pick up the Nagel book. That doesn't go very high, the speed studies. And like, I can always get better at doing that, no matter how tired my face is.
Right.
It's not the day that I'm going to really, put in a lead mouthpiece and work on my high G. So finding ways to structure your practice so that you do make progress every day, that engenders this feeling of, acceptance and progress and motivation. And there's all sorts of other psychological constructs that come about when you start making more reliable progress in your practice sessions. Right. I mean, in one of those videos, I say that motivated practicers are good practicers. They're people that get stuff done. Yeah. They're people that notice the improvement they make day to day so that they're happier about engaging in the process again tomorrow. If all you've done is, jam up against that same wall that you've been jammed up against for a year, really unmotivated. You're not going to be like, let me go knock on the doors at 8 a.m. in the Juilliard 4th floor. And
some of us are predisposed to like digging into the weaknesses. Like first thing, like the very first thing of the practice session, it's like getting to the weak out of a good intention of growth. Yeah. But how do you get into that positive cycle where it's, action leads to motivation, leads to action, leads to motivation?
I think I just did a talk at ITG, and I didn't title it this, but I probably should have. But essentially, you want to start great, and then stay mostly great, and then end great. I don't know, it seems like so obvious, but I think starting great, the idea is to begin with greatness. Yeah. I went to ITG last year, and Mike Sachs gave a talk about Stamp and his time with Stamp. And it was like an hour-long thing, and he said a bunch of stuff that I don't remember. But what I do remember is how good he sounded at the very beginning of his trumpet day on like Stamp 1 or whatever, the mm-hmm. He sounded glorious. Yeah. I still remember that sound in this giant hotel conference room. And he began his day with beautiful, lovely tones. And so establishing that from the very beginning of your day, super important. And then as you work your way through the day, the story really is about managing error. It's about staying in a place where most of the sounds you're making are great, but about 15% of them aren't.
Right.
And then you get to address those 15% and how you structure your activities so that you stay mostly great.
But your mindset isn't listening for error, right? It's trying to convey artistic picture, right? And then along the way, as you're prioritizing that artistic picture, that intuition, you notice when you're not, living up to that, when you're not getting the matches, right?
Yeah.
Is that an important distinction to make?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, essentially, the way that you perceive error when you're playing a phrase is as an immediate and relatively surprising deviation from what you intended to play. Yeah. So if you're going along playing something and then something's out of tune, it's an immediate deviation from that because you're intently focusing on it. This is Arnold Jacobs, right? The Song and Wind. You're following along so closely to your very detailed idea of how you want it to sound that really minor deviations are picked up by you and they bother you. They bother you enough to make you stop and go back and do it again. Yeah. And the only way those deviations can emerge in our practice, the only way mistakes like that can happen, is if you have an idea of what you're aiming to do. Mm. I mean, like if you got your phone up and you're texting somebody while you're playing something, that's not going to get you any better at anything because you have to be able to perceive that.
I mean, when my first year at Juilliard was the year that the iPhone came out. Oh. So this wasn't as prevalent. I mean, in high school or even I didn't get a smartphone until I think I was in grad school. No, that's not true. But I walk through the practice rooms at UT only because I have to pass them on my way to my office. I'm not checking up on the students.
No, but it's an incredibly interesting walk, right?
You can learn a lot of people watching Office episodes and Candy Crush while they're practicing, right? It's nuts. So let me share one thing that I learned. So one week I wanted all my students to choose any 1 hour of their practicing that week and just record it and upload it unlisted on YouTube.
Excellent.
And they did it. And it was by far the most progress I've heard out of the entire semester. You know the reason why?
Because they were being watched.
They couldn't use their phones.
Because they were filming.
They're filming themselves. Isn't that crazy?
Wow, just taking that out of the equation.
Even if I didn't listen to it, right, which I did, I promise. I listened to every minute.
Oh, yeah. I know. I know you do. That is, I think, and I say this, and it's going to sound ageist, and I don't mean for it to be.
Yeah.
But when I see practice deviating from from effective to less effective, I think for people our age and older, it was typically a metabolic thing. Like, I'm tired. I'm stopping making progress because I'm physically tired and I can't make the sounds I want to make. I think the most important source of that deviation now is not physical fatigue; it's attentional. Let me look right into the camera. Aside from time, attention is the most important resource we can devote to the thing we're trying to do. And if you are setting up a situation where your attention is divided, you're not learning as much as you can. And making the decision to put your device on airplane mode, or there's an interesting study out of, I think, University of Chicago that came out a couple of months ago, showing a statistical degradation. So people got, I'll say this in simpler language, people got worse at what they were trying to do, not only when their phone was next to them, but when their phone was off in the room, as compared to people whose phones were out of the room. So just having the device near you off it makes you worse at what you're trying to do. And helping young students navigate their attention, I think, is really, really important. That it's not enough just to do the activity. You have to be paying attention to it in order to get the most out of it.
Right.
And that's hard. That's really hard. I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of young students.
Yeah.
Especially, it's even weirder when they're reading off tablets that have all their music. And so finding a way to structure that so that they can have their music, but nothing else. All notifications off. Turn notifications off.
Even if you have to print some music, especially if you're honest with yourself and you find that you're prone to distraction, and who isn't?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe try a month reading music from a book.
Oh yeah. I mean, you said it. We grew up at a time when there weren't things in our pockets that were profiting from our attention.
Right.
Like, that's a huge difference in how people are living life right now. Exactly. I mean, you and I've got a phone over here. It's off, but we had many years where that wasn't a thing. And the young people that are working on practice now, that's a huge hurdle that I think very few young people I've spoken with, I think, are giving that enough of a think.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and we seem like, we're preaching. We are.
In my day, it was just...
But it's because there's value to it. I think it was you who talked about when you were at Juilliard and you wanted to go listen to a piece that you're preparing. It was an ordeal because...
It was an ordeal.
It was like a 3-hour commitment, right?
Yeah.
You had to go to the library, you had to find the score, you had to check out the CD.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then there were a bunch of CDs that you couldn't actually check out. You had to listen there at the listening stations.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's not like you could just go home and do it. And some of it was on records. There's a bunch of vinyl. Like if you wanted, Bruckner 1 or whatever, they might not have had it.
But the act of doing that tells your brain, hey, this is important. Right? This is valuable, right?
Yeah.
And are you more willing to soak in that information?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it has value at that point, right? That I've taken time out of my life to dedicate to this task. So I'm a little more invested in it. I had a student one time in a methods class came and they played. They were learning how to play the French horn, and they played what was it? I think it was the horn solo from Tchaik 5. And they were so proud that they had found this new piece new to them. They had found it on an Instagram reel. And I remember being kind of, happy for them, like, good for you. I'm glad you now know that Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony exists. But then I was also really sad for them. Like, it's cool that that's how you came across this one melody, but it's clear that you haven't heard the whole symphony. You're, a junior in college at this point. I just thought that, your musical life would be so much more, so much deeper, with so much more breadth.
Yeah.
If you made time in your life to sit down and listen to entire pieces. And
right.
I don't know what the data is on that, but it seems like young people are doing stuff like that with less frequency.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not like that's a problem. I think what that ends up doing is it encourages a lot of them to make music for social media, which is fine. But it's way different than what we were training to do when we were 20.
Right.
I I wasn't trying to make an edited 3-minute video of me playing the trumpet beautifully. I was trying to just get better at music.
Yeah.
And I know that I don't mean to be as nostalgic and wistful, like back in the day before cell phones. But, if you're looking to get good at a really difficult thing, like playing an instrument at the highest level, you need to think really carefully about how invested you are in all of the tasks that you're engaged in with that. Listening, studying, collaborating, practicing, auditioning, failing, all of that should get your full and undivided attention.
Right.
If you want to get the most out of it.
Right.
Because I hate to think about it in a comparative way, but if you're not paying attention to those tasks, somebody out there is. Mm-hmm. And if y'all are pining after the same, scarce opportunities for people to get paid to play music, start paying attention to that. Start paying attention to all that. It's to your benefit.
So what's next for you in terms of your research interests? What's on the horizon?
Okay. So Bob and I have a couple of things cooking. They're in various stages of done, but one thing that we're actually trying to futz with right now, and I don't want to talk about it in too much detail because we've got a couple of things that we're playing with, is finding ways to incentivize students to think like experts do in the practice room. Because experts perform as well as they do because they practice the way they do. And they practice the way they do because of how they think in the practice room. And that's sort of what we've talked about, like what you're paying attention to and what errors emerge and what you do with those errors and how you decide to respond to that. All of that is why you could play as well as you do. But it's sometimes difficult to get students to think the way that you do in the practice room. And so we're trying to find ways to essentially, and I know this it's not a great analog, but like jazz students transcribe jazz solos. We're trying to find ways to get music students to transcribe expert practice sessions, to think more about why. Like if I had a video of your practice, why did Caleb stop there? What do you think he's going to do next and why? Because you do all this stuff rapid fire. I mean, your practice sessions, if I was to have a practice session of yours, my guess is I would have to pause between trials, between repetitions, in order to show people what it is that you're doing, because it happens so quickly and the decisions you're making are so quick. But to give students space and time and an incentive, money, to think about why it is that great practicers stop when they stop. What do they do next? How do they design every minute of their practice to get the learning to happen?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a thorny thing, but I think we're going to find a way to get through that and find some ways to do it.
Yeah, sure.
We're also looking for we want more evidence, because we know they exist, but fewer young people film their practice sessions, middle high schoolers. But I want to create a sort of practice database of young people practicing like experts do. Because great practice is not related to skill level. It's not only as if the greatest musicians are the most effective practicers. It's imminently possible for young, new students to behave as experts do, just with easier music.
Yeah.
And I want to find more of that and tell that story of the commonalities between how musicians of all ability levels make change happen in the most efficient ways.
That's cool. If I were to, I'm just thinking about myself, if I were to record my practicing and make it available to you or to, put on YouTube, just as a resource, like if I were to be honest, I would just the act of recording that session, despite my best intentions of trying to keep it as consistent as possible.
You would do it differently.
You're right. Is that something you noticed in the videos you watched? Not that you didn't really have anything to base it on, right? But just knowing the people that you were studying.
In the research world, I think I've got this right. There's a name for that. It's called the Hawthorne effect. Okay. And essentially, and I haven't looked at this in years, so I may be off on this, but essentially there is a people do things slightly differently when they know they're being watched.
But the more you do it, the more regular.
Yeah. My suggestion to anyone that wants to get a better feel for what's happening in their own practice, or if they want to share it with somebody, is to record every practice session for like a month and then just pick one. And I know that's a lot of data, but you can erase it afterwards. But it's rather than here is this one thing that I'm curating specifically for this thing, just film it all the time and then pick one and try to make it as typical as possible. Because when I'm working with either students or professionals, at this point I've actually had a few sessions with professionals that want to get their practice better. That's my suggestion, so that you get some of that weirdness out. You're not going to get all the weirdness out, but some of the weirdness out, so that we can look at what you generally do. Yeah. So yes, that is a thing. There's some ways to work around it.
Cool. Yeah.
So, you have also made a little bit of a transition, not from entirely performing to entirely teaching. You've gone from sort of mostly performing to, is it fair to say mostly teaching?
I thought it would be that way after Canadian Brass, but it's actually...
You've had a busy year.
I'm still in the middle of trying to balance things, because I've said yes to more performing than I think I'd have the opportunity to do. I had the album come out, and you know what it is with Canadian Brass, amazing 10 years, and we had about 75 concerts a year, but it was, by and large, it was like a show that I had to keep fresh, and I had to make sure that I was always in shape for the show and ready to go. Yeah. And that changed at Christmas time, and we would change repertoire every once in a while. But I knew exactly what I needed to do. But the last few months, for me, it was a solo recital, actually 3 different solo recitals, one at NTC, one in Wyoming, one in Tennessee. And then I had a string of Brandenburgs to play on piccolo. And then I had a couple album release concerts. Mm-hmm. These are all different programs, right? Yeah. Then I went to New York and played a few Baroque concertos, different program. And I'm talking about, and then I played the Salvation Army Band solo concerts. So I'm literally, every weekend was a different thing. Wow. So it's not just different repertoire, but different kind of approaches of playing, piccolo trumpet versus a solo recital, right? Versus playing with brass bands. So answer your question, no, it's been about the same. In terms of my horn on the face time, it's been the same.
Wow.
Or more, probably more. And I didn't expect that at all. But in terms of me being, I've always seen teaching and playing as really mutually beneficial. And it's easy to say that to kind of justify an overbalance in your life. And I think at certain times I was definitely overbalancing things. And when you do that, certain things get compromised, whether it's your sleep,
right,
or your family, or your health.
I also agree that teaching and playing they're symbiotic. I mean, one of the things that we try to get our students at UT to think about is how to harness all the things that they've learned as performers and turn that into designing experiences for their students. It's not always a clean experience, but as you invest more time and more thought and more expertise into teaching, what do you notice about your own playing? I mean, how do those two things actually interact with the teaching and playing? My guess is that your playing informs your teaching, but does your teaching inform your playing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I don't have anything to base this off of, because I took a certain path and I decided to pursue university teaching. So I don't know what my life would be like if I didn't choose to do that. But in my experience, I'm a much better player because of my teaching and because of the mindset that puts me in, just consistently. And there's something, and you know this, when a teacher is committed to getting in the trenches and becoming a partner with their students in their own learning, not just necessarily saying this is what worked for me and do this and check it off the list and do it by rote and you'll have the same success, and if you don't, then it's on you because I can't handle that. I'm too insecure to handle that, right?
Yeah, right.
So for me, I'm exhausted after I teach because I'm trying to approach from all these perspectives I'm trying to understand how my students learn, and talking to you is really helpful because it illuminates how I can do that and create these experiences for them, which I need to get better at. But I'm trying to identify with how they're learning, right? And then also see what perspectives they're not really aware of potentially. And it's exhausting to try to keep troubleshooting and try to keep that creative curiosity in the environment. And all right, this is not working. Let's pivot to this other path. When you determine if a path isn't working, What's happening behind the scenes that I might not know about in terms of habits and morale, right?
Yeah. So I was going to ask you more about what you thought was going to be next in your evolution as a teacher. That's where I was going with that line of questioning.
Yeah. Okay.
And because you asked me what I've got coming next, but you're what, 35?
36. Yeah.
36. So you've got 30 more years of being a pedagogue ahead of you.
Lord willing.
Yeah, and I'm wondering. I was just wondering what you see that. Where do you see that going?
Yeah.
Short term, long term.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, teaching I do view it as a calling, not just a gig. And what I mean by that is a commitment to, once again, partnering with my students in their learning process, not just, prescribing something for them to do because this is the path that worked for me, or this is what worked for my teachers or my school of pedagogy. I'm so interested in hearing you talk about creating experiences for our students, because I find myself, sometimes I fall into the trap of trying to convey to a student a concept which has been filtered through several layers of like perception and sensation. And it's like, how do you communicate how something feels on my chops to a student? You know what I mean?
You can't.
Right?
You can't. I mean, we have this idea that we can talk students into doing things differently.
Yeah.
We can't do that any more than we can talk ourselves into doing things differently. It's the sort of the way that I used to describe it. It's not as if I can just think really hard about being a linebacker in the NFL and then tomorrow be really good at being a linebacker in the NFL. It's not how learning works.
Right.
And it's only through the experiences that are shaped by feedback that allow them to get better at the thing.
So, I mean, along those same lines, it's like, okay, so let's say, I'm going to assume a lot here, but let's assume that a student is having a chop issue that needs to be solved mechanically.
Uh-huh.
Let's make that assumption. Could be wrong. My job as a teacher is not necessarily to diagnose exactly what's going wrong with their tongue position or their pressure or their jaw or their pivot angle or their lip, how much lips is inside the mouthpiece. If I see something that's really obvious, like they're playing on the red of the top lip,
Yeah.
But other than that, one thing, I don't know how many things are super obvious from looking at it, because we have this big curtain called the lips, and you can't really see what's going on behind that. But instead of trying to tell them, oh, here's what's happening, you're putting too much pressure on the bottom jaw or whatever, I can create experiences for them to learn that themselves. And maybe not learn that explicitly or objectively, but learn through that process of trial and error in a way that behaviorally builds confidence after confidence, right? And that's something that, like, I mean, I'm not great at right now, but I feel like I'm getting better at it. And I just think just kind of staying curious through the whole process is the key, like you said.
Yeah.
So in terms of teaching, I think, continuing to cultivate a studio environment that is really supportive and has a super high standard, balance in every aspect of teaching and playing and learning. There's balance, right? And so that's something I found that's so important. If I try to create a studio environment that is just about the hang, right? Then I mean, maybe it's fun, but I mean the excellence won't be there, right? But if my students think that all that I want from them is excellence, and I'm not there to have their back, or even
as a human,
if when they get up in front of their classmates in studio to play this etude that they have some struggles with, if they're not super confident that, hey, Emily has my back and she has my best intentions in mind and at heart, and afterwards she's gonna encourage me and also give me some thoughts and nuggets of information that's gonna help, then we're kind of doing a disservice to our students, I think. So there's a balance there, I think. And it's going to be a continual process for me to learn that balance and to assemble, the right team of people to cultivate that, because it's not just me cultivating that, right?
Plug Whiff's book, man. Have you read Side by Side?
Yeah, absolutely.
Such an excellent book for helping us all think about how it is that we cultivate is probably the right word. How we cultivate a sense of community and a sort of shared effort that we're not just invested in our own growth. Yeah. It's like, no, we all get better if we invest in collective growth. Like that's how, he's made such a healthy environment up there. And I think it's a beacon for the rest of us that want to not just teach individuals well, but to teach communities how to be good humans. I think it's a great calling. I love your use of partnership. That thinking about being a teacher, although obviously it's a hierarchical thing, and you are the professor, and there is a TA, and there are some doctoral students and master's students and undergrads, but essentially you're a partner in their teaching.
Right.
Who, through your decades of excellent musicianship and thoughtful approach to your life, you can guide them as a partner in that. But it's a melding, which I think is excellent.
And it's really it's a unique form of learning, these one-on-one private lessons, right? It's like
there's nothing else like it.
At UT, we have an open lesson policy, and we have a coffee station set up. So
cool.
People just come, they get coffees, and they watch each other learn. And it's with the exception of like if someone's going through something that's a little bit more,
personal,
sensitive, embouchures, changes, or if they just want to talk, they always have that freedom to say, hey, this is going to be a closed. Take your coffee and get out. Right?
Yeah.
But that's helped so much, and it's growing. I can see the growth, and I can see just the health, of the studio, and it's a privilege to be a part of that. It's so cool. Yeah.
Good.
And having you there is awesome. So I can't wait to have you involved in the studio more as much as you want.
Like Uncle Micah, you guys have your family, and I'll be show up at Thanksgiving and say
that's right. Cool. Hey, it's been a privilege. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Caleb.
Yeah, appreciate it.